Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're diving deep into something I know you're really interested in getting a better understanding of the U.S. federal government.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to be looking at it specifically from a conservative viewpoint in terms of potential reforms.
Right.
You've shared with us some excerpts from Mandate for Leadership, which is this pretty big policy blueprint from the Heritage Foundation.
Yeah.
It's kind of like a roadmap for a potential conservative administration in 2025.
Yeah. And I think what's really striking right off the bat is the title itself, call it Mandate for Leadership. I mean, they're intentionally invoking the Reagan era.
Oh, interesting.
It's a deliberate attempt to try to connect this blueprint to a past era of, I guess, perceived conservative success and signal a return to those principles.
Okay, so this document isn't just like some dry policy wonk stuff. It's like a statement. It's like a rallying cry almost.
It is.
And it's really expensive. It covered a whole bunch of departments and agencies and outlines, proposed reforms and shifts in policy. We're talking everything from the State Department to the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, to the intelligence community, even education reform.
Yeah, it's ambitious, for sure. And some of the proposals are pretty eyebrow-raising.
Like what?
Well, for instance, did you know there were multiple security failures flagged at the U.S. Agency for Global Media?
Like, what do you mean?
We're talking about potential vulnerabilities to foreign spies.
Whoa, okay, hold on. Back up. U.S. Agency for Global Media, what is that?
Fair point. The U.S. Agency for Global Media oversees things like Voice of America and Radio Free Europe.
Yeah.
Basically, U.S. government-funded media outlets that broadcast internationally.
Okay.
The document is essentially saying that this agency, which is supposed to be promoting American values and countering propaganda, might actually be compromised itself.
That's wild.
Yeah.
So it sounds like security is a big concern in this document.
For sure.
But what else kind of jumps out at you in terms of overarching themes?
Well, right from the start, they hammer home this idea of returning power to the American people and taking it away from what they call the administrative bureaucracy. It's this deep distrust of the federal workforce, this belief that it's become too powerful and unaccountable.
And they're not just talking about spies.
Right.
They actually get into like the nitty-gritty of how federal employees are compensated. Right?
Oh, yeah. One statistic they highlight is that a federal employee with just 5 years under their belt gets more vacation and sick leave than someone working at a large private company plus better health benefits.
Really?
It's all part of painting this picture of a bloated, inefficient, and overpaid bureaucracy.
So what's the solution? Do they want to fire everyone in the government?
Not quite, but they do call for something called a responsible career management service.
What is that?
Basically, it would give the president more direct control over the bureaucracy,
Okay.
moving away from what they describe as an autonomous bureaucracy and essentially making it more responsive to the will of the elected president.
Okay, so that makes sense. If you believe that the government has become too big and powerful, then reining in the federal workforce seems like a logical step.
Yeah.
What other big picture themes are they pushing?
Well, hand in hand with shrinking the bureaucracy is this emphasis on fiscal responsibility. It's this classic conservative argument that we need to cut spending, reduce the deficit, and lessen the burden on taxpayers.
And part of that is cutting regulations on businesses and individuals, right?
Absolutely. They argue that excessive regulations stifle economic growth and make it harder for businesses to thrive, which ultimately hurts everyone. It's about freeing up the private sector to create jobs and generate wealth.
But it's not all just about economics and shrinking the government. They also weave in social issues, right?
Oh, definitely. This document is steeped in traditional values. There's a strong pro-life stance and an emphasis on what they call the natural family.
Okay.
This is particularly apparent in the sections on the Department of Health and Human Services, HHS, and the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID.
So it's not just about how the government operates, but also about shaping the moral fabric of society.
Right, and this is where things can get controversial because those values don't necessarily reflect everyone's beliefs.
Sure.
But it's important to understand where they're coming from and how those values inform their policy proposals.
Okay, we've got a good grasp on the overall themes. Now let's get into some of the juicy specifics. What are some of the proposals that really jump out at you?
Well, for starters, their stance on China is pretty dramatic. They flat out identify China as the primary threat to U.S. national and economic security. It's not even a question for them.
Wow, that's a pretty hardline stance. So what do they propose we do about it?
Across multiple departments, defense, state, commerce, they call for increased defense spending and a far more assertive foreign policy to counter China's ambitions. Think of it as a peace through strength approach, a belief that we need to project military might to deter aggression.
It sounds like they're advocating for a pretty significant shift in how we deal with China.
For sure.
But there's more to this document than just foreign policy, right?
Oh, a lot more. Another area that's really fascinating is their take on environmental policy.
Okay.
They want to completely revamp the EPA's approach.
Yeah, from what I skimmed, it seems like they're not big fans of how the EPA has been operating.
They're highly critical of what they call fear-based rhetoric and argue that environmental regulations should be grounded in transparent, reproducible science. They even bring up past environmental disasters like the Gold King mine spill and the Flint water crisis as examples of EPA failures under previous administrations.
Okay, so they're basically saying that the EPA has been too driven by ideology and not enough by sound science.
Exactly. And they're pushing for a more data-driven, less emotional approach to environmental regulation. They argue that this will lead to better outcomes for both the environment and the economy.
Okay, we've got foreign policy, we've got environmental policy. What else is on their hit list?
Well, they also have some pretty strong opinions about the intelligence community. In their view, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, which was created after 9/11 to coordinate all the different intelligence agencies, is a failed experiment.
Really? Wow, they want to dismantle the whole thing?
Not exactly, but they do want to chuck things up.
Okay.
They argue for giving more power to the National Counterintelligence and Security Center and bolstering the FBI's resources to combat threats, particularly from, you guessed it, China.
So it's all about streamlining the intelligence community, making it more efficient and focused on what they see as the most pressing threats.
Precisely. And they're especially worried about countering espionage and protecting American intellectual property. They see China as the main culprit here, and they want to make sure the U.S. is doing everything it can to safeguard its secrets and its competitive edge.
Speaking of safeguarding American interests, they also have some interesting ideas about the State Department and how it handles treaties.
Yeah, this is where we see that theme of turning power to the people play out in the realm of foreign policy. They argue that the State Department has overstepped its bounds by entering into international agreements without proper congressional approval.
So it's about reining in what they perceive as executive overreach and restoring the Senate's constitutional role in ratifying treaties.
Exactly. They want to make sure that any international agreement the U.S. enters into has the backing of the American people as represented by their elected senators. It's about checks and balances, about ensuring that no single brand of government becomes too powerful.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that this Mandate for Leadership document is setting the stage for a potentially dramatic shift in how the U.S. government operates. But we've only just scratched the surface. There are so many more departments and agencies to explore, and I'm sure plenty more controversial proposals to unpack.
Oh, yeah. You're telling me we haven't even touched on their plans for education?
Oh, right.
Which include a pretty radical proposal, or their ideas about reining in the Federal Reserve, which could have huge implications for the economy.
This is definitely a deep dive, and we're just getting started. Stay tuned, because in the next part, we'll delve into even more specifics from this fascinating and, dare I say, provocative policy blueprint.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we're back and we're ready to plunge even deeper into this Mandate for Leadership.
Absolutely.
We left off talking about, how this document aims to reshape the U.S. government kind of from top to bottom.
Yeah.
So where do we go from here?
Well, let's talk about the Department of Homeland Security, or DHS for short.
Okay.
This document really hones in on streamlining and refocusing DHS, arguing that it's grown too big and strayed from its core mission.
So it's not just about shrinking the government, just for the sake of it.
Right.
It's about making sure that each department is really laser focused on what it's supposed to be doing.
Exactly. And they're particularly concerned with what they see as mission creep within DHS.
Mission creep.
Yeah. They argue that it's taken on responsibilities that are outside its original scope, leading to a bloated and inefficient bureaucracy.
Okay. I'm intrigued. Give me some specifics. What kind of mission creep are we talking about?
Well, they point to Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE.
Right. ICE.
As a prime example, they argue that ICE has been increasingly tasked with auxiliary missions that have little or nothing to do with immigration or customs enforcement.
Hold on. ICE doing things other than, ICE stuff.
Right.
Like, what are they doing? Running bake sales?
Well, they don't get into specifics in this excerpt.
Okay.
But they do argue that ICE has strayed from its primary mission, which they define as enforcing immigration laws and securing the border.
Okay.
They're essentially advocating for a much stricter interpretation of what ICE should be doing.
That sounds like it would be a major shift in how ICE operates.
Definitely. They want to see ICE focus solely on enforcing the Immigration and Nationality Act as written by Congress without any wiggle room for interpretation. They even want to eliminate something called prosecutorial discretion, which allows immigration officials to decide which cases to pursue.
Wait, so every single immigration violation, no matter how minor, would have to be prosecuted?
It would certainly have a huge impact on how immigration law is enforced on the ground.
Yeah.
And it aligns with their broader stance on immigration, which emphasizes border security, strict enforcement, and a reduction in illegal immigration.
They also want to see ICE stop closing out pending immigration cases, arguing that this has allowed thousands of people who are in the country illegally to go free.
Right.
It's like they're saying no more second chances, no more leniency.
Right, and they go even further by proposing to defund non-governmental organizations or NGOs that assist immigrants who are in the country illegally. They want to redirect those funds to border security and detention facilities.
So it's a pretty hardline stance. They're not just talking about reforming ICE.
Right.
They're talking about, like, reshaping the entire immigration system.
Exactly. It's a core element of their vision for a more secure America. And they don't stop at ICE.
Okay.
They also take aim at FEMA, the
Hmm.
Federal Emergency Management Agency.
Oh, right, FEMA. That's the agency that gets called in after hurricanes and other natural disasters, right?
Right, but they argue that FEMA is overtasked and ends up compensating for a lack of preparedness at the state and local levels.
So they're basically saying that FEMA shouldn't be bailing out states and localities that haven't done enough to prepare for disasters.
That's their argument. They propose shifting more of the responsibility for disaster response back to the states, allowing FEMA to focus on truly catastrophic events that overwhelm state and local resources.
Again, it's this theme of federalism, of returning power to the states
Yeah.
and limiting the role of the federal government.
Right.
But what about the Coast Guard?
Mm-hmm.
That's part of DHS too, right?
Yes, and they have some thoughts on that as well.
Okay.
They argue that the Coast Guard's mission needs to be scaled back to match congressional budgeting. Essentially, they're saying you're trying to do too much with too little money.
Mm-hmm.
They also call for a long-range shipbuilding plan modeled after the Navy's 30-year plan to ensure that the Coast Guard has the ships it needs to carry out its missions effectively.
So it's about aligning resources with priorities
Yeah,
and making sure that the Coast Guard is equipped to handle its core responsibilities.
exactly.
What else do they want to shake up within DHS?
They also delve into the internal structure of DHS,
Okay.
recommending some significant organizational changes.
Like what?
Well, for one, they want to consolidate the department's external communications function by merging the Office of Partnership and Engagement into the Office of Public Affairs. It's all about streamlining the bureaucracy and reducing the number of offices reporting directly to the Secretary of Homeland Security.
Okay, so fewer layers of bureaucracy, more efficiency, and a clearer chain of command.
Exactly.
That seems to be kind of a recurring theme across multiple departments.
It is, and they also make a point of emphasizing the need for a strong chief of staff to support the secretary and ensure that the president's agenda is implemented effectively.
So it's like they're saying, okay, we've got this vision, now we need the right people in place to make it happen.
Precisely. Now let's shift gears and move on to the State Department. This is where we really see how a conservative administration might approach foreign policy. And let me tell you, they don't hold back.
Okay, I'm all ears. What's their beef with the State Department?
They argue that the State Department has strayed from its core mission of diplomacy and national security.
Okay.
They believe it's become too focused on promoting progressive social agendas and climate change policies, neglecting its primary responsibility of advancing American interests on the world stage.
So it's this idea that the State Department has gone woke, that it's more concerned with, like, global issues than with American interests.
That's the gist of it, and they call for a complete recalibration of how the State Department operates.
Okay.
They want to see a more hard-nosed, pragmatic approach to foreign policy,
Mm-hmm.
one that prioritizes American power and influence.
Give me some concrete examples. How do they propose to change things?
Well, for starters, they want to see a return to a more traditional approach to treaties.
Okay.
They emphasize the need to restore the Senate's constitutional role in ratifying international agreements, arguing that the State Department has bypassed Congress and entered into agreements that don't have the backing of the American people.
So it's about reining in what they see as executive overreach
Mm-hmm.
and ensuring that any international commitment the U.S. makes has the support of the Senate.
Exactly. They also advocate for stricter enforcement of visa reciprocity.
Visa reciprocity. What's that all about?
It means that if a country makes it difficult for Americans to get visas to travel or work there, then the U.S. should make it equally difficult for citizens of that country to get visas to come here.
Okay.
They argue that the U.S. has been too generous in granting visas to foreign nationals from countries that don't offer similar access to Americans, and they want to see a more reciprocal arrangement.
So it's about fairness, about making sure that Americans aren't at a disadvantage when it comes to, like, traveling and working abroad.
That's part of it, but it also reflects their broader America First approach to foreign policy.
Okay.
They're essentially saying that we need to prioritize the interests of American citizens and businesses, even if that means taking a tougher stance in our dealings with other countries.
And speaking of tough stances, we can't talk about their foreign policy vision without mentioning China.
Right.
They're very clear about their view of China as the primary threat to U.S. national and economic security.
Mm-hmm.
They're not pulling any punches here.
Not at all. They call for a much more assertive foreign policy to counter China's ambitions, arguing that the U.S. needs to adopt a cost-imposing strategic response to make Beijing's aggression too expensive to pursue.
Cost-imposing strategic response? That sounds pretty intense. What does that even mean in practical terms?
It means using all the tools at our disposal,
Okay.
economic sanctions, military deployments, diplomatic pressure to make it clear to China that there are serious consequences for its actions. They're essentially saying that we need to be willing to push back, to draw a line in the sand and say this far and no further.
It's a pretty hawkish stance. It sounds like they're advocating for a new Cold War with China.
Well, they're certainly not shying away from confrontation. They see China as a rising power that's determined to challenge American dominance, and they believe that the U.S. needs to meet that challenge head on.
And it's not just China. They're also critical of how the State Department has been engaging with the Middle East and North Africa.
Right. They argue that the previous administration essentially abandoned the region, creating a vacuum that allowed American adversaries like Iran and Russia to gain influence. They call for a renewed focus on preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons, providing security assistance to regional partners like Israel and Saudi Arabia, and ensuring that those partners have the military means and political support to defend themselves.
So it's about reasserting American leadership in the region.
Yeah.
And pushing back against Iranian influence.
Right. They see the Middle East as a vital strategic region, and they're concerned that the U.S. has been ceding ground to its rivals.
They also advocate for reforming international organizations like the United Nations.
They're very skeptical of the UN's effectiveness and argue that it's often biased against the U.S. They believe that the U.S. should either use these organizations to promote American interests or withdraw from them altogether.
So it's this idea that if we can't shape these organizations to our liking, then we're better off going it alone.
That's one way to put it. It's a very unilateralist approach to foreign policy.
Okay.
A belief that the U.S. is strong enough and independent enough to act in its own best interests without being constrained by international institutions or agreements.
Okay, so we've got a clearer picture of their foreign policy vision, assertive, confrontational, and very much America first.
Yeah.
What about the intelligence community? We touched on that briefly earlier.
Yeah, they have some pretty strong opinions about how the intelligence community should operate.
Okay.
As we mentioned, they see the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, or ODNI, as an unfinished experiment.
Right.
They believe it hasn't lived up to its promise of improving coordination and information sharing among the different intelligence agencies.
So what do they propose instead? Do they want to go back to the way things were before 9/11?
Not exactly. They do want to streamline the intelligence community and make it more efficient.
Okay.
But they also recognize the need for better coordination. Their solution is to empower the National Counterintelligence and Security Center, or NCSC.
Wait, NCSC, that's a mouthful. Remind me what that is again?
The NCSC is the government's primary organization for coordinating counterintelligence and security activities across the entire intelligence community.
Okay.
All about protecting America's secrets from foreign spies and ensuring that classified information doesn't fall into the wrong hands.
Okay, got it. So they want to give the NCSC more power and resources to counter threats, particularly from China.
Exactly. They believe that China poses the greatest espionage threat to the U.S., and they want to make sure that the intelligence community is laser-focused on countering that threat.
They also seem to be big fans of the FBI. They want to give the FBI more resources and legal authorities to conduct investigations and prosecute espionage cases.
Right? They see the FBI as the tip of the spear when it comes to counterintelligence, and they want to make sure that the Bureau has the tools it needs to go after foreign spies and protect American interests.
But they're not just about throwing more money and manpower at the problem.
Right.
They also want to see the intelligence community streamlined and refocused on its core mission.
They argue that the intelligence community has become too bloated, too bureaucratic, and too focused on peripheral issues that don't directly contribute to national security. They want to see it pared back to its essentials with a clear focus on gathering and analyzing information that is critical to protecting the country from external threats.
Okay, so they're all about efficiency, accountability, and laser focus.
Sounds familiar. It's a consistent theme throughout this document. They want a government that's lean, mean, and effective, a government that prioritizes American interests above all else.
And that brings us to the U.S. Agency for Global Media.
Right.
Remember that one? The agency that's supposed to be broadcasting American values to the world, but might actually be full of foreign spies.
Oh yeah, that's a juicy one. And they don't mince words when it comes to their criticisms. They highlight a series of security failures at the agency,
Okay.
arguing that it's been incredibly vulnerable to foreign infiltration.
It's almost like a spy thriller, right?
It is.
You've got these foreign intelligence operatives potentially embedded within this agency that's supposed to be promoting American values.
Yeah.
It's pretty wild.
It is, and they point to multiple investigations conducted between 2010 and 2020 that flagged serious security lapses and a disregard for federal information and personnel security protocols. They're essentially saying that the agency has been incredibly sloppy when it comes to protecting its information and its personnel.
So they're not just worried about foreign spies, like planting bugs or stealing secrets.
Right.
They're also worried about foreign influence within the agency itself.
Exactly. They even mentioned that known foreign intelligence operatives were removed from the Open Technology Fund and Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty during the Trump administration.
Wow, that's pretty alarming. It's like they're saying that this agency, which is supposed to be countering propaganda, might actually be a vehicle for foreign propaganda itself.
That's the concern, and they call for a complete overhaul of the agency's security practices and a thorough review of its personnel to ensure that it's not compromised by foreign influence.
So background checks, security clearances, the whole 9 yards.
Basically, they want to make sure that everyone working at the agency is loyal to the U.S. and that there are no foreign agents operating within its ranks.
But it's not just about security. They also criticize the agency's management and content, arguing that it's become too focused on promoting progressive social agendas and that its journalistic standards have declined.
Right. They believe that the agency has strayed from its original mission of providing objective and unbiased news and information to audiences around the world.
Okay.
They argue that it's become too politicized, too focused on pushing a particular worldview rather than simply reporting the facts.
So they want to see a return to what they see as traditional journalistic values, objectivity, accuracy, and a focus on reporting the news without bias or spin.
Exactly. They want the U.S. Agency for Global Media to be a credible and respected source of information about America and the world, not a mouthpiece for any particular political ideology.
Okay, let's move on to another agency that plays a key role in foreign policy.
Okay.
USAID, the United States Agency for International Development.
This is where we see their conservative values come into play in the realm of foreign aid.
Okay.
They take aim at USAID's focus on climate change initiatives, arguing that it's come at the expense of other priorities, including promoting economic development and countering China's influence.
It sounds like they see climate change as a distraction from more pressing issues.
They're definitely skeptical of the emphasis on climate change within USAID. They argue that the agency should be focusing on promoting energy independence in developing countries, including through the responsible management of oil and gas reserves. They see this as a more effective way to promote economic growth and reduce poverty.
So it's about providing practical assistance that will help developing countries improve their economies and raise their standards of living,
Yeah.
rather than focusing on what they see as more abstract or ideological goals.
Right, and they're also critical of USAID's support for abortion and family planning programs. They argue that these programs violate the principles of the Protecting Life in Global Health Assistance Policy, which prohibits U.S. foreign aid from being used to fund abortions.
So it's a very clear statement of their pro-life stance. They want to ensure that U.S. foreign aid aligns with their moral and religious values.
Absolutely. They're not just concerned with how U.S. foreign aid is spent. They're also concerned with the message that it sends. They want to make sure that U.S. foreign aid promotes values that they believe in, including respect for life, religious freedom, and traditional family structures.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. From border security to foreign aid, from the intelligence community to the State Department, this document offers a pretty radical vision for how a conservative administration might approach foreign policy and national security.
It's a sweeping critique of the status quo, and it lays out a very different path forward, one that prioritizes American strength, American values, and American interests above all else.
It's a bold vision, and it's sure to generate a lot of debate. But we're not done yet. We still have several more departments to explore, including Health and Human Services, Education, Agriculture, Energy, and Justice.
And let me tell you, they've got some interesting ideas about those departments as well. Buckle up, because we're about to dive even deeper into the world of conservative policy proposals.
Okay, so let's wrap up our deep dive into this mandate for leadership. We've explored their vision for national security and foreign policy, but this document, goes even further, outlining a conservative roadmap for a whole range of domestic issues.
It really is a blueprint for, a sweeping transformation of the federal government. And there are some particularly noteworthy proposals for the Department of Health and Human Services, or HHS.
HHS.
This is where we see some of the most contentious social and cultural issues, come to the forefront.
Okay, so let's talk about HHS. What are some of the hot-button issues that they're tackling?
Well, they go straight for the jugular, criticizing the close relationship between the National Institutes of Health, NIH,
Okay.
the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, CDC, and vaccine manufacturers.
That's interesting. What's the nature of their concern there? Are they suggesting that, something nefarious is going on?
Well, they argue that this close relationship creates conflicts of interest and has led to a lack of accountability. They even suggest breaking up the NIH's monopoly on directing research funding, arguing that this would foster more competition and innovation.
That's a pretty bold proposal. It sounds like they're trying to shake up the entire medical research establishment.
Yeah.
What else are they taking aim at within HHS?
As you might expect, they're very focused on issues related to abortion and reproductive rights. They call for a reversal of the FDA's approval of chemical abortion drugs and reiterate their long-standing opposition to Planned Parenthood receiving federal funding.
So it's a very clear statement of their pro-life stance. They're not just talking about restricting abortion.
Right.
They're also trying to limit access to organizations that provide reproductive health care services.
Exactly. It's a core element of their social agenda, and they're using this document to push for policies that align with those values.
And it's not just about abortion.
Right.
They also advocate for policies that promote traditional family structures.
Yeah.
Including, encouraging marriage and responsible fatherhood. It's like they're trying to use the power of the federal government to shape the moral fabric of society.
You could definitely interpret it that way. It's about promoting a particular vision of family and morality, one that they believe is essential to the health and well-being of the nation.
Okay, let's move on to the Department of Agriculture, or USDA.
All right.
What do they have in store for America's farmers and ranchers?
Well, they criticize what they see as an overly centralized and interventionist approach to food policy under the previous administration. They argue that the government should not be trying to transform the food system or intervene in the supply chain.
So it's a classic free market approach. Let the farmers do their thing and let the consumers decide what they want to eat.
Exactly. They want to see a return to policies that support American farmers and ranchers rather than focusing on issues like climate change and equity, which they see as distractions from the USDA's core mission of ensuring a safe and affordable food supply.
They also take issue with the expansion of federal school meal programs.
Mm-hmm.
Arguing that they've strayed too far from their original purpose of providing food to low-income children?
They believe that these programs have become too broad and that they're now serving children who don't really need assistance. They want to see a more targeted approach to school meals, focusing on those who are truly struggling with food insecurity.
Okay, so it's about streamlining government programs.
Yeah.
And making sure that they're reaching the people who need them most.
Right.
And speaking of streamlining,
Oh boy.
they have a pretty radical proposal for the Department of Education.
That's an understatement. They actually call for completely repealing the Department of Education.
Whoa, abolishing a whole cabinet-level department.
Yeah.
That's a pretty big deal. What would happen to all the programs and responsibilities that the Department of Education currently handles?
Well, they don't go into a ton of detail about that, but they do suggest that many of those programs could be handled by other federal agencies or returned to the states. They also strongly advocate for school choice, arguing that parents should have the freedom to use public funds to send their children to the schools that best meet their needs, whether they're public, private, or charter schools.
So it's about empowering parents and promoting competition among schools.
Mm-hmm.
They believe that this will lead to better outcomes for students by giving parents more options and by incentivizing schools to improve their performance.
Exactly. They also emphasize the importance of parental rights in education, arguing that parents should have a say in what their children are taught, particularly when it comes to sensitive topics like race and gender.
That aligns with their broader stance on social issues.
Right.
They believe that parents should have the primary responsibility for shaping their children's values and worldview.
Right. And they're concerned that schools are increasingly promoting ideologies that conflict with the values of many parents.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here. It's clear that this document lays out a pretty ambitious and, in some cases, controversial vision for the future of the U.S. government.
Yeah.
But we're not done yet. We still have a couple more departments to explore. What about the Department of Energy? Any surprises there?
You bet. They call for a major shift in energy policy away from what they see as an obsession with climate change and towards a focus on energy independence and dominance.
So it's about promoting American energy production, including fossil fuels, and reducing reliance on foreign sources. It's that America First approach applied to energy policy.
Exactly. They criticize the previous administration's focus on renewable energy, arguing that it's driven by ideology rather than sound economics. They want to see a more market-based approach to energy policy, one that allows all forms of energy to compete on a level playing field.
They also seem to be concerned about the potential for grid instability as we transition to more renewable energy sources. They argue that we need to prioritize reliability and resilience, even if that means continuing to rely on fossil fuels for the foreseeable future.
Right, they're not convinced that renewable energy sources like wind and solar are ready to meet the demands of a modern economy. And they're worried that a rush to transition away from fossil fuels could lead to blackouts and other disruptions.
Okay, one last department to cover, the Department of Justice, or DOJ.
All right.
What's their take on the state of law enforcement in America?
They argue that the DOJ has become politicized and has failed to uphold the rule of law. They point to what they see as a pattern of politically motivated prosecutions and a reluctance to enforce immigration laws.
So they're basically saying that the DOJ has been weaponized to target political opponents and to advance a progressive agenda.
That's their argument. They want to see a return to what they perceive as a more neutral and objective approach to law enforcement, one that is focused on enforcing the law fairly and impartially, regardless of political considerations.
They also call for a number of specific reforms, including streamlining the FBI, restricting its involvement in combating so-called misinformation and disinformation, and prohibiting the agency from going around the Attorney General.
They're concerned that the FBI has become too powerful and that it's been used to target conservatives and suppress dissenting viewpoints. They want to see the Bureau's power curbed and its focus narrowed to traditional law enforcement activities.
And of course, they reiterate their call for greater emphasis on prosecuting immigration offenses and ensuring that immigration laws are enforced consistently across the country.
Right. They see immigration enforcement as a core function of the DOJ, and they're critical of what they perceive as lax enforcement under previous administrations.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. This Mandate for Leadership document really lays out a comprehensive and ambitious vision for how a conservative administration might approach governing in 2025 and beyond. It's a bold vision, and it's sure to be met with both praise and criticism.
It's important to remember that this is just one perspective, a blueprint for how a particular group of policymakers would like to see the country governed. It's up to each of us to evaluate their proposals, to weigh the potential costs and benefits, and to decide whether this is the direction we want America to go in.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about. Could this document, if implemented, truly shift the direction of the U.S. government? What would the implications be, both domestically and internationally? Those are questions worth pondering.
Absolutely, and we encourage you to continue exploring these issues, to delve deeper into the arguments and evidence presented, and to form your own conclusions. This is just the beginning of the conversation, and it's a conversation that we all need to be a part of.